Welcome to Uncomfortable, conversations about culture and Christianity. My name is Eric, and today I'm joined by Josh Dotzler. How's it going?
What's up, brother? How you doing?
All right. You're one of our teaching ministers here at the church. Also, you're the CEO of Abide. Thanks for taking the time to join us for this whole ride. You're going to be on the whole show. We're going to do it all.
You're going to keep me the entire time, man.
You guys on here.
Like, I don't have to be too careful about what I say.
No, just feel free to go with it.
I love it.
We also have Jess.
Hello, world.
And Alex.
Happy to be here.
All right. Good deal. Again, thanks, Josh, for joining us. Hopefully we'll be seeing more of you on the show. But we always have a really important stuff to talk about at the top.
That's true.
And I figure we should handle that now.
Yes, and that's my cue.
Yeah, that's your cue, Alex.
Just no wasting time.
I scroll social media every so often, and an earth-shattering question came across my feed, actually in the form of a picture, and it was, "What is the best Little Debbie product of all time?" You know Little Debbie?
You know Debbie?
You guys know,
Little Debbie?
And I had to look at what most of them were. But I'm going to have to give my opinion, and then I'll let you all share.
Oh, right. You had to look at what they were.
I was just going to say, I'll probably need a list of what they are.
Yeah, I mean, Star Crunch, banana marble cream pie. There's a lot of things.
Keep going.
Those Christmas, the Little
Christmas
Debbie's.
trees?
Oh, I remember the Christmas trees.
Or they have Halloween. The donuts, those glazed donuts.
Glazed donuts.
Fig bars, cosmic brownie, Star Crunch, fudge rounds, oatmeal cream pies. I think those are like the most popular, which is Swiss rolls, Nutty Buddies,
pecan pinwheels.
Pecan pinwheels.
I haven't thought about any of these for a long time. The Nutty
My
Buddies.
answer though is oatmeal cream pie.
Oh,
Partially because it's good. The other part is because I've always been jealous of, what is that movie, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids?
Oh, yeah.
Remember when they
when they're sitting in their
oatmeal
midi
cream and they're like eating the oatmeal cream pie, like the giant oatmeal cream
Wow,
pie.
you're
And
taking
I always
us back today.
wished I could do that. It'd probably kill me, but I think that's the best.
If we could recreate that for you, we would.
Thank you. Andrew, Trucker, Andrew, I believe in you. You can recreate me an
He could
oatmeal
at least
cream pie.
drive it here.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, Josh, you tell us what would your choice be?
honestly, that was going to be the top of my list.
Okay.
Number 2, which is probably a tie, would have to be the Nutter Butter.
Nutty Buddy.
Nutty Buddy.
Yep.
Mostly because I like to take them apart layer by layer, and they're not good for you, but I loved eating into those things.
That's the number one on a
Come on, man.
poll that I saw on myrecipes.com.
Wow.
However,
very
official that
reputable
is.
source. Yeah. Jess?
That's fun.
My favorite also would be the Nutty Buddy. I don't know if I've ever called it a Nutty Buddy.
What have you called
What
it?
did you call it?
I don't know.
You got the
I'm trying to
off-brand?
remember.
You got
probably
The peanut
the
butter
Dollar
wafer
General
bars.
brand. But okay, there's another one that somebody recently brought in that I tried, and I was like, how is this still? It's like a marshmallow pot pie or something.
Oh, the moon pies?
Moon pie. I'd never had one.
They don't.
I didn't
theirs
know
isn't
there was
called the moon
different flavor.
pie.
Is
They
that
have.
in Little
Did you say a
Debbie's?
marshmallow? I thought you said
like
pot pie. I was like, are you?
Theirs are called the marshmallow pies, but the moon
okay.
pie is like
Yeah, I'd
its
never
own
had
brand.
those before, so that was recent. But
Those are good.
Yeah.
Actually.
I don't normally keep the stuff in my house, and I feel like if I did, my kids would constantly ask for this kind of stuff.
Well, I know our listeners,
But-
they love Little Debbie. So let us know what your favorite
Little
is.
Debbie.
After,
yeah.
What's yours, Eric?
let us
Yeah,
know.
I guess oatmeal cream
Do
pie
tell
is
us.
just so classic. I don't know how it's hard to move away from that. And the Nutty Buddy, I'd go for a Swiss roll maybe sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
But I like to, it's weird the food habits you have. Like you peel it apart. That's fun to do. These super processed cakes.
Yeah, it was almost tragic a few
yeah.
years ago when Twinkie almost went under, but a company saved them.
They were off the shelves for a while.
So
this is the first time I'd thought of a Twinkie in a long time until
Wow.
they were gone, and you want what you can't have.
life-changing.
I really hope we made people hungry, and now they're raiding their pantries.
The way that Josh described taking apart the Nutty Buddy, I mean,
I can like visualize it as I'm talking about it.
So now I kind of want one.
Yeah. All right. Well, there you have it. Up next, we have headlines. All right. First in headlines, I have to make a follow-up statement after our headlines last week. We had one of their stories was about how Wordle saved an 80-year-old woman from a hostage taker. Which two things. I got a couple emails telling me the word I couldn't think of or the phrase was hostage taker because for some reason I could not put those two words together. So thank you for everyone who wrote in to help me with.
And were they naked? That's what I'm waiting for.
Yeah, that's what I was.
That's
wondering.
the other thing is I mentioned that the hostage taker was nude, and you both looked at me like I had fallen out of my rocker, and so I went back and read the story, and it specifically says that this person was bloody and naked because they crawled in through a broken window.
The taker did.
The taker, not the 80-year-old woman, but the hostage taker. So just a clarification, so we're not spreading fake news about what happened. It says right here in the article that we referenced last week, the 80-year-old woman was held hostage for 17 hours by the man who is reported to have been naked and ordered her to do some other things. So we're
breaking news.
That's we're clarifying things and moving on. But
you
I
don't
just
want
want
to get put on the fake news cycle.
Right.
Eric, I just want to say I appreciate the deep dive you took into just following up on this.
Yeah, the humility.
You really have a gift.
real humility on display by me. It's really just about me
of journalism
trying to cover my tail after saying something that I thought was completely off basis. Anyways, we got some other headlines for you this week. The first one is a local story coming from Omaha.com. It says OPS elementary teacher receives presidential award for excellence. This is the Bancroft elementary teacher, Leah Litz, recently received a presidential award for excellence in mathematics and science teaching from the White House. And this is for a program that she's a part of called Zoo Kindergarten. So she's a zoo kindergarten teacher.
At the zoo.
At the zoo, yes. A zoo kindergarten teacher at the zoo.
At the zoo in their program.
We love talking about the zoo here. There's so many.
There's always something going on.
There's Omaha headlines always involve the zoo because it's one of the things we have going on, I guess. But
I always forget that there is education at the zoo like that, like preschool, kindergarten.
But I think we would be amiss to not just take this moment in time to just be grateful for teachers right now. I mean, because I think teaching is at an all-time need. There's a need for it, but also stress levels. My wife subs usually on Fridays when I have off, as you all are listening to this podcast. The demand for them this year, and even why they've been taking, a lot of school districts have been taking more time off and extra days, is like just teachers are taxed, and then people aren't subbing, and just where the pandemic has left us for a lot of reasons, whether it's masks or just kids that are more unruly because they were locked up for so long, and the stresses. I mean, it's always been a thankless job, but I'm just so grateful even now in this season. As we were driving back from the Abide campus today, I drove by Monroe and Benson, and just was like, just struck to pray for those teachers, and especially Omaha Public Schools has a close to my heart with Harry A. Burke High School being where my alma mater is, and so just grateful for teachers.
That's good.
So
yeah, it can be a thankless job, and they do so much for so many. I was wondering, how do you get recognized at that level doing that job? You know, how do they find a teacher like that and recognize them at that level?
So it said the recipients received $10,000 from the National Science Foundation, which manages the awards on behalf of the White House. I didn't see it in this, but I can only assume they're nominated somehow.
Yeah.
But
that's amazing.
Yeah, it really is. All right, let's move on to our next headline. This one, it comes from, that's the Wordle headline. We don't want to read that one again. We are done with that one.
We already know the facts, Eric.
Yes, this one comes from the Wall Street Journal. It says, houses of worship face clergy shortage as many resign during the pandemic. Now, this article is really a deep dive. They interviewed a lot of different people who are in different forms of clergy, whether that's, Jewish rabbis, Catholic priests, evangelical leaders, things of that nature. And overall, it's kind of reflecting what we're seeing, I think, as a culture on a whole with staffing issues and people maybe the pandemic definitely awoke something in people where they're going, am I doing what I should be doing? And, we're seeing, so it's not just, it's the service industry, but I think we're seeing it across the board, people questioning maybe what they're called to do, I guess, for a simpler way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of just articles in the Christian world. Kerry Newhoff always talks about this. He's kind of one of the leading, I think, voices for stats and all that kind of stuff, and Barna. But just, there's been so many, I think, pastors for a lot of different reasons. I think it's tough to lead right now.
Right.
I know you, Josh, wrote a book even in the middle of that about just as a church leading through the pandemic and didn't quite know what it was going to turn into, but the challenges of people and their opinions, whether it's about masks and social distancing or vaccines, people really want churches to take a side on that issue, and then they'll leave you and they'll usually not be nice on the way out the door or comments, or, small churches, rural churches that they just couldn't meet, and it was their only form of gathering, and they didn't have, we're just blessed at CCC to have had already an online presence. And so, man, for a pastor that is dealing with a lot of people in a rural community that don't value, the internet probably in the same way, aren't as connected, their whole entire job changed. I mean, when you went from being with people all the time, I remember 12 weeks that our building was shut down, and you're just making up stuff as you go and really not being with people. That's one of the, for me, one of the difficulties of transitioning from even student ministry to being online is things like this podcast, where you hope people are listening and you see analytics, but you don't really know, is life change happening? And you don't hear, you're not face to face with people and hear those stories as often, I think it's a challenge. And so I could see how that's happening.
I think ministry just by itself is hard.
Yeah.
I mean, when I've heard people say, if we didn't have to work with people, life would be a lot easier. And the truth is, life is messy. You talk about a pandemic and all the challenges that brings up. I mean, burnout, just people being wore down with trying to meet the needs of people. I think it's been a tough season. And some churches, like a Christ Community, have really, I think, leveraged the pandemic and really used it as a tool to reach more people and to see ministry advance. But for some, they didn't have the support, they didn't have the resources. And, I think the gap, the crisis that we've experienced, I believe it provides more opportunity for the church and for churches like Christ Community. But it's been a tough season for a lot of people who have been in ministry.
It made me think too that pastors, ministers, even just leaders in the church, it's kind of like an overlooked group of people. I even think of, like, when I saw this, I automatically thought of just like compassion fatigue, of like just the wear and tear that's come from nurses and doctors. But it's also like people are looking to the church and saying, what's your response to all these issues we're already dealing with, plus a pandemic and everything that comes with that?
And a pretty blissful election cycle in the middle of all
right,
that,
exactly. There hasn't been anything else going on, but
racial
it made me think
tension,
of that too.
Yeah.
Of just like, okay, and I mean, I would say that people in ministry are not necessarily the highest paid people, and so it's like you're just doing a lot out of what God's calling you to do and out of your calling, and right, like you said, Josh, burnout, things like that. And then where does that fall? And so this is saying it's falling on a lot of like lay people or volunteers. It's like those are people we have to protect too.
Yeah.
Well, and it's not even just the polarization of the, opinions around medical things, whether it's vaccines or masks and that sort of thing, and politics, but then you're dealing with trauma, people who are losing their lives, or you're dealing with people who have lost loved ones, and you're trying to help them cope with that. And I think like you said, it's probably underappreciated by a lot of people, like all that empathy that, puts a lot of stress on a person.
I think people say too, it's lonely at the top. And so a lot of leaders have gone a long time without relationships. You add a pandemic on that, more isolation. It's just easier to get caught up in your own feelings, your head. I mean, there's realities to mental health too. And I think all of that compiles, and it's like, man, it's easier to walk away. And there are a lot more jobs that pay a lot more and a lot less stress. And so I can see the tension that a lot of leaders are under, and we've all felt it. And I can see how when you're isolated and you're not in community, it's so much easier to walk away.
Yeah. All right. Well, that does it for headlines today. Up next, we're going to be talking about, what people want, whether it's truth or tolerance, and what that looks like. As Christians, how do we choose between truth and tolerance? I think this is a fascinating topic that maybe we need to do some work to explain. Because, those two words can mean a lot of different things to people. I think even the word tolerance, to me, kind of feels like it has a negative connotation sometimes. But let's start with truth. How do we define truth? So maybe around this table, we can all share thoughts about what truth means to us. Then also we'll give an actual definition of that. But Josh, you're in the hot seat today, so let's start with you. Like, when you hear the word truth, what does that mean to you? Is that individual truth? Is that a broader thing? How do you explain it?
It means I'm right.
Yeah.
Done. Yeah. Hang it up.
Done.
Guys.
Yeah. I think about between my wife and I, our relationship, our marriage, we're in a conversation. Some people would call it an argument. And, what I believe and the perspective I have is right. And it's my truth against her truth. And so I think ultimately truth is what we're standing on, what we believe is right based on our values, based on our belief system, based on our personal experiences. And that's where truth becomes challenging, because we all have a truth based on what we believe. And I think just this whole topic, and I won't get into it because I know we're just talking about truth, but it's like, this is the essence of the gospel. Truth, tolerance, grace, truth. And I think, what all these different issues that we're going to talk about even here on this podcast, I think has highlighted the challenge we have as Christians and as the church when it comes to this idea of truth, and tolerance.
Yeah, I know for us, we're in the middle of a series right now on origins, on the beginning of the earth and all that kind of stuff. And even in a conversation we were having in my small group, the other day, there's a lot of ways you can be pretty dogmatic about truth is word for word what the Bible is saying about a day,
right.
And what, how many days did God actually create things in? And everybody in my small group is like, we believe the Bible is true. We believe the Bible is our source of truth. But even in that discussion, there was this allowability for different opinions on what those days meant, or how much time, in each of those eras was. But then where we all came back to was, hey, the truth that is commonplace for all of us, the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, is that, hey, this is around Jesus, that Jesus is ultimately, not to Jesus took it fully, the way, the truth, and the life. And so we're able to kind of step back a little bit and say, okay, but what's the essence? What's the core of truth from the Christian perspective? But then what are these layers of truth that I believe? And I for one guy that's deeply into science in our group and is a pharmacist, he really has to latch on to the fact that truth is the reality of science, and it looks like our world is older than 6,000 years old. And so living in that tension, I think, gets into a little bit of the tolerance thing. But often, like you said, in my mind, truth becomes the realities that I know,
Right.
and I can't divorce myself from the situations that I grew up in, my education, my family situations, those experiences, and I just can't divorce myself from them either. And so
I think when we hear truth, we think of do you swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth? But so much of it is based on experiences. And I think if we both saw the same thing, our life, our experiences, our interpretations of what we saw might make us say the same things, but it might make us feel different things, and so our reactions are different, and then it just, to me, starts snowballing. It influences the way that we respond to other people. It just affects so many different things. And so I feel like I'm glad we're talking about this, because there's a lot to wrestle with in there.
Well, the definition of truth is that which is true or in accordance with fact or reality. And I think when we are in a society that have people believing all sorts of things, even things to me that sound ridiculous, like flat Earth, and people who wholeheartedly believe that, you know,
Bigfoot.
But it's one of those things where, like, I don't know how they rationalize it. I'm like, we've got pictures from, you know, space, but well, that's a cover up, and that's this and that, you know, and I mean, that maybe even sounds silly, but when you realize that there are people who actually believe it, what does truth mean anymore? And what, you know, because I think there are just certain things we can say. Like, I could say the sky's blue, and well, you could argue with me that, well, no, it's this, whatever, you know. And it's one of those things where the flip side of it is, even in Christian culture, sometimes you'll hear people who will say, well, you just need to preach the truth, and, you know, tell people the truth. They need to hear the truth. And so it's all these things, when they fall on opinion, it doesn't feel like truth sometimes when it's based on opinion. And how do we reconcile that?
I feel like it's almost impossible as a Christ follower to talk about one without the other. I mean, I've heard people say, you know, in this situation, two things are true.
Yeah.
I think about last year, Coach McDermott made a comment to his players about, and used the word plantation. And obviously, you know, it made the headlines, tons of, you know, people on the black side who said, man, he needs to be fired, get rid of him. People on the white side are like, well, hold up a second. It was one word, one comment. And I responded, you know, just with sharing some of my thoughts that got turned into an article. And for me, I was sitting there looking at what he did, and knowing him and who he is, in my mind, two things were true. Something bad was shared, but also, man, that one thing doesn't tell the whole story. And so, you know, the Bible says that Jesus was full of grace and truth. And I feel like it's hard to, when we just focus on truth, you know, the definition you read, that which is true. Well, what is true? Whatever you think is true. And I, you know, I think when for me, when I get caught up into just looking at the facts, I can miss out on the story. I can miss out maybe on what God wants to do. So it's for me, it's really hard to like fully disconnect and talk about the difference between the two, because I've just found more times than not, there's a narrative that, man, two things are true. Life isn't as maybe black and white as I've thought it was. A lot more gray in there. In marriage, relationships, children, life experiences, I think, you know, start to show that.
Yeah, I think we joked about it earlier, fake news a little bit, and we live in a culture that values almost supremely above anything else truth. I mean, at least that projects that we do. There's entire, you know, news sources that are always fact checking one another, and, you know, you fact check based on, you know, a news source or an article or having actual evidence there, but then someone will fact check against that fact. And so even coming up with facts, and I think we're in a point too where even some of the places like science, you know, that have been sources that we've looked to for truth, people are doubting more and more. Even government, for whatever reasons, like CDC, and we're just in this unique, peculiar place where we're like, well, these are the people that are supposed to be providing truth, but then sometimes truth gets rewritten by a new truth with more discoveries or whatever. I mean, obviously, there was plenty of reason to believe flat Earth for centuries, you know, and then you find out more, and then this new truth happens. And so it seems like we've got just layers of archaeology of what truth is, and how do we continue to move forward in that kind of space. And there's those truths of like realities that we're seeing, but then there is like this ultimate truth and an ultimate source that we have to come to for where what creates fact, what is reality, what is good, what is bad. And I think that's probably wired into humanity of this longing, this desire for truth, but how we get there and navigate it is where I think it becomes so difficult. But I do think we see in there's not somebody that doesn't crave truth. I mean, except, Satan, who's the father of all lies and wants to distort what truth is. But I think as people, we all crave, long for truth, and then it gets messy because our interpretations don't always line up.
Well, when everything is distilled down to like a soundbite or a quote on social media, it feels like a lot of times truth isn't really what people are after. They're after, confirmation bias, or they're after being right. And so here's this argument or I'm outraged, and that's because of the truth. And it's one of those things where they're just looking for someone to agree with them, and if they don't agree, then they're not being truthful. But yeah, it just gets so messy when we try to navigate it, because I do think there are things that are pretty simply true. And so when we start to blur those lines, it's like, where is that give and take? How do we communicate with one another if we're constantly being misunderstood because we all have our own truths?
Well, and how do we communicate with each other? I mean, that's a huge part of it. We each have our truths, but how you speak to me and how you share your truth, or how you hear my truth and respond to it, that determines if I even hear you or not, or if I even, stay engaged in a conversation. And so how we act and how we carry ourselves, where we are in proximity to people is so important.
Yeah. For example, we were at Abide's campus today as a staff, and you were sharing, Josh, about just some harsh truths about Omaha. About redlining, about, just some of the blatant systematic things that were set up to keep people at bay and keep people in poverty, and just even systems that work against, certain individuals in our society. And those are tough truths to handle, because most of the people probably that did it weren't all doing it with ill intent. You even look at our founding fathers and, racism as being a part of that, and slavery. And there were some good things that these people did. And so it's to that hand of, man, these both can be true, that these are good people with good intentions, and flawed people at the same time with evil intentions. And they're just trying to fight for what helps them, in life. And sometimes we forget about how it hurts others and the wake that's being caused. And so even wrestling with those two things, but to start to make reality, to start to make progress, we have to look at our past. We have to look at the realities of the ugly truths that are there, to start to call them out and to build trust, I think, to be able to move forward. And so even in that, like, man, it's discomfortable. I mean, I was uncomfortable just sitting and listening to some of those things. And I'm like, but how do I deal with it? Because I'm not a part of the problem, but kind of I'm a part of the problem if I'm not being a part of the solution. So
it's good.
It's difficult.
Well, and even some of that, you talk about, slavery and what our country was founded on. We used biblical truths to push people to act in a certain way and treat people inhumanely. And even the truths of what I understand today, a lot of it has been based on experiences I've had living in the community that I'm in. So if you were to just share facts with me, if you were to just share, talk about whether it's redlining or some of the history, I wouldn't have the context, I wouldn't have the conviction that I share today if I didn't live next to poverty. Yeah. If I didn't live next to individuals who are dealing with the generational realities of redlining and black men being put in prison. And so I think, again, our experiences can enhance certain truths, or it allows us to discredit other people's truths because, well, I didn't experience that. Yeah. And I think as followers of Jesus, I love the word you use, trust, because I do think I see all throughout Scripture, God uses trusted voices to share certain truths that actually lend credibility and allow us to hear, receive, and then to learn from those individuals. I think that's part of the role of pastors and leaders. We're supposed to be a trusted voice in the current cultural climate that we're in, and you can get your news from anywhere. I mean, social media, anybody can post their truth.
Yeah.
And if you are responding bad, man, I'm canceling you. I'm turning you off. I'm turning you away.
Unfriend.
I'm unfriending you.
Yeah.
And I think that's where, as Christian leaders, we've lost a little bit of credibility with our voices because we've leaned in one direction or another when it comes to some of these cultural realities. But I do think we're supposed to be a trusted voice to lead people closer to biblical truth versus just scientific truth or social truth.
So in some ways, it's our experience and our proximity to others that makes the truth more digestible in a way, you know, like just to help us even fully rationalize what we're hearing when we don't believe it. The other side of this conversation is tolerance. Let's spend a little bit of time with that word. What comes to mind when you hear that word?
First thing that comes to my mind is like the bumper sticker that says coexist. Okay. You know, and so I think that's probably one of those things that that's just the first place my mind goes. And I'm sure maybe people have seen it, but it's a bumper sticker that has the words coexist. But then each symbol is kind of like a different religious symbol or non-religious symbol that represents, I think, this idea of, hey, there's 7 billion people in the world, and, you know, we need to exist together in some kind of utopia or peaceful harmony. And part of me loves the notion of it, but then I'm also like, man, just coexisting. Like if my wife and I's relationship was simply just coexisting, like if we could just coexist together, like, man, that's not thriving either. And so that's the first place my mind goes of what it looks like to be tolerant, or the push to be tolerant.
I think tolerance for me has been a journey that I've been on, because this automatically makes me think of, I grew up in a very legalistic home and church. And so I've had to do some work in this area of just like questioning people that don't tolerate or don't choose to understand. And something that has really helped me is Myron Pierce said one time, if you don't understand something, then you have to withhold judgment. You don't get to judge. You have to withhold judgment, and you have to ask questions of why. And so for me, like that, as I've processed, even like in counseling, it's been tolerance to me means listening. Tolerance to me means being curious about where somebody's coming from, and like, what's your story, and who are you, and why is your truth your truth. And so I think that sometimes that can look, especially to other Christians, that can look very passive or very accepting, or I just bring everybody, everything's okay. But I think for me, like, it's a journey of pausing and slowing down, and I want to love and hear your story.
It's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I think of tolerance in our culture that is going after success, I hear it as a negative word. You know, don't tolerate mediocrity. You don't want to tolerate anything that's less than success. Yep. But I also think of it as this idea of, you got to pick and choose your battles. And you've got to, you know, what hills are you willing to die on? What is really important? What quote unquote truths are really important that you're really willing to go there? And when it comes to relationships, what am I willing to give up so that this relationship can be more important than my truth? And I think in every relationship, I mean, I always go back to marriage. I always go back to, it's like, there's certain things that I believe that I have to be willing to, you know what, we're not maybe going to agree on everything, but I don't need to keep fighting that. Yeah. I don't need to keep trying to get somebody to see everything that I see. I think even in the ministry context, one of the things that I've recognized is God has a unique calling on all of our lives. And too often as ministry leaders, I want other churches or organizations to value what I value and to do what I do. And you have to get to the place where it's like, you know what, like, not everybody's called to the inner city context. Not everybody's called to fight just for justice in the way that I'm called to do it. And when I put that value on other people and other organizations, I'm holding them to a standard that's inconsistent with who God's called them to be. Mm-hmm. That's not something that's not a battle I need to go after and fight. I just need to be content with who I am. So I think in terms of, man, there's certain battles that we don't need to fight. I love what John Maxwell, I heard him talking about evangelism. He said, most people want to find 1% of something that they disagree on with somebody and spend 100% of their energy talking about it.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
He said, I have 101% strategy where I find the one thing we agree on and I spend 100% of my energy focusing on that 1%. Wow. And so I just thought that was a cool picture, when it comes to this idea of tolerance.
Yeah. I think like my gut reaction when I hear it is, well, I don't like that, but I'll tolerate it. And so I think there's sometimes a negative thing when you hear
condescending.
Yeah. Like I don't approve of that, but I guess I'll tolerate it, But the actual, I guess the definition we have here of tolerance is the ability or willingness to tolerate something, in particular, the existence of opinions or behavior that one does not necessarily agree with. Mm. But I love to search the synonyms for words, and synonyms that come up for this is forbearance, sufferance, open-mindedness, lack of prejudice, patience. So I think hearing some of those synonyms even helps kind of frame what tolerance can mean, maybe more than our gut reactions to what that word is. Mm-hmm. Around our discussion that we've just had, how do we think that applies to society at whole? When they use the word tolerance, is it something usually used in a positive light, a negative light? How do we see that around us?
I think I for sure, see the people that, in my view, long for or maybe promote tolerance the most seem to be, some of the more intolerant conversations that I've had. For me, I think it's even positioned me in some ways to, I'm labeled, because I'm a pastor and Christian, I think there's labels like bigot that get thrown out there, homophobe, anti-science, whatever that is, there's labels that kind of get thrown out there. And I've had to learn, to walk into spaces, and I try not to even tell people what I do right away, because I already know that I'm going to kind of get labeled as not liking them. And there's some good reason for it, because not all people in ministry have been perfect. And there are some truths even to, their assumptions. But I've found, that people are unable to even accept or listen to my ideas if I'm not fully accepting or ready to embrace whatever that might be, ideology, a lifestyle, a sexual preference, or whatever, that I have to, if I don't embrace that, if I'm not open to everything kind of being okay and celebrating it almost, then I get labeled as the intolerant one. I'm like, that feels intolerant of you, and so that's just how I feel sometimes sitting in my seat in ministry and family and just navigating some of the just cultural nuances.
I feel like we just live in a culture where everyone's asked to pick a side, politically, on the race conversation, education, everything is about picking a side. And if you're anywhere in the middle, I mean, you're canceled. You're done. You're not a voice that people are listening to. And so I feel like we really speak against this idea of tolerance. And so it puts people in a position where they feel like, well, I guess if I'm more of this, then I got to side with this group over here. And so I think it takes away our ability as Christians to be curious. Because when you show up standing on a side, you lose the ability to speak to the other side.
Yeah.
And you lose the ability to speak to anybody who believes something different, who might put you in a category and label you. And so I think our culture wants to do everything they can to really have people pick sides and talk down on this idea of tolerance, because I love that one of the words you used was lack of prejudice. We all have preferences. And those preferences put us on a side, they put us against people. And if we're not careful, all of our prejudices or our preferences will make us prejudiced towards other people.
Right.
And so I just, this idea of being curious is so powerful, because when I'm curious, I'm interacting with you to understand your story, not to put you in a category. And I think that's the power of what tolerance does. But I think our culture really, again, I think of social media. It's like, take a side. Everyone wants us to take a side, make these earth-shattering statements that put people against each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember even you talking, Josh, about just one example, like Black Lives Matter, and just even there was this desire for someone to take a stand one way or another. And I remember you just sharing like, hey, like I could value that without the hashtag, and that you tried to do that, but you probably got heat from people, multiple angles of like, no, you need to say this or you shouldn't say this. And so there's just those, especially labels that come in or hashtags that come in that you can just jump on a train very easily because it's trendy, but not always know like the roots behind something or who's going to hijack a definition. And so much of that I feel like always happens in our society.
Yep. No, you're exactly right. And I think part of it, this is talking about even truth and a little bit of tolerance is like what we're saying or how we're interacting. I think lifestyle matters too, and how we're living. And so when it comes to an issue like the whole Black Lives Matter, you don't have to make a statement like that when your life is saying that. And you can make other statements using different language that says and validates the same thing, without just jumping on board with a cultural narrative that says, if you don't do this, then you're not representing this. Yeah. So I think lifestyle, with both of these words, tolerance and truth, the picture that keeps coming to my mind is Jesus and the woman caught in adultery. Two things were true. Man, the people were right. She made a mistake. They were ready to stone her. But Jesus also forgave her. Yeah. And he shifted the narrative of what those people were communicating and shared truth, but also extended a lot of grace. And some people would say he tolerated her behavior. Yeah. But it was the third narrative, I would say, of what Jesus was showing us.
And I think on the flip side, that narrative in John 8, like, sometimes it becomes a scapegoat too, for, I think, Christians that are like, well, who are you to judge? Why? All right, you cast the first stone, And so sometimes there's also an ability to want to lessen our sins or lessen the accountability for, how we fall short of the glory of God by just throwing around scripture like, hey, you cast the first stone, or only, God can judge me, or that's not scripture, that's Tupac, but
I was like, I heard that before.
Or judge not lest you be judged in Matthew, I think is where he stole it from. But I think sometimes we can even take the truth of scripture in that story and then manipulate it to make us feel better, or to make us feel like, well, why are you calling me out? If I approached every conversation with my wife in that way, like, whatever, I left the toilet seat down while why don't you throw some stones at me? Then it just it becomes redundant and secular, and we never actually make progress towards looking more like truth or looking more like Jesus and the way he modeled life.
Well, even like something as simple as us talking about Little Debbie's in the headlines, Little Debbie treats, things like that. Someone at this table could have said zebra cakes were their favorite, and we'd all thought, well, what's wrong with this person? And or even something like, I might judge you if you like mayo on a burger. Like, I don't think that belongs on a burger, but I might, whatever, we can get in a real heated argument about it. But then here we are kind of distilling these big, huge conversations into personal preference and personal, worldview. And it's like, well, this is the thing that I like. I don't understand why you don't like this, And so even in our relationships, whether that's through parenting or with our spouses or significant others, it's like, one lesson that took me probably nearly 20 years to learn with my wife is that we deal with conflict so differently. You know, she's the type that needs to kind of just shut down and process what's going on and come back to it. They say don't sleep on it. Well, that doesn't work for her. Like, she needs to sleep on it. You come back the next day, she's processed it. For me, I'm like, I need resolution now. We're going to stay up till 2 a.m. and talk through this until we solve what's going on.
Who's right?
Well, I ultimately learned I was,
Alex.
you know what I mean? It's like I had to tolerate that style if I wanted peace, because it's like I have to let that process happen, because if I just keep forcing this, it's not going to get anywhere. And I think so many times maybe we find truth and we want others to know that truth. It's like a new Christian. Well, I found truth. I need the world to know this. But it depends. It's the delivery mechanism. It's how we share that truth with others that's going to, you know, the outcome will be dependent on how we share it.
So good. I couldn't agree more. And I think somebody gave me a visual once. They said, you know, you've got a steak, this great, nice steak. I'm a big steak guy. And they said you serve it on a trash can top. It doesn't serve the same way as when you serve it on a nice plate.
Yeah.
And so you can share good truth, but if it's not done in the right way, it doesn't have the same effect. I think, too, the other thing that I've noticed for myself is sometimes you don't need to share everything. And sometimes you can actually hold, you know, the truth, but maybe that person's not ready to hear it, or that environment is not the right place to share it. And I think sometimes, like, we want everybody to know all of our truth. And sometimes I think the most mature thing we can do is just hold on to it, either save it for another time or maybe don't share it at all.
Yeah.
And I think in the tolerance conversation, the two words that I often see kind of people try to equate to one another is the term love and acceptance. And so I think a lot of times, you know, someone says, you cannot love me if you don't accept, you know, who I am. And sometimes acceptance is the most unloving thing you can do. Not accepting a person, but accepting a behavior. As a parent, acceptance is one of the most unloving, you know, things that I could do. Accepting that, you know, if I just accepted, I am attracted to women outside of my wife, and I just accept that she just needs to get over it. You know, that would be the most unloving thing I could do for my family, and the ripples of that would be totally dangerous. And so I think sometimes in our society, we want to weave the two together, and then we think that because someone does not accept all my decisions, or they don't accept the lifestyle I'm choosing to live, or whatever that might be, that I cannot love that person. And I think couldn't be more far from the truth. And sometimes acceptance is the most loving thing you can do.
Right.
But too often I think we've made those two words synonymous. And then I've seen this, I mean, especially working in student ministry, I've seen in so many conflicts, people get those two words confused, and then it equates, you know, just broken relationships and so much pain because we can't separate the two and understand how they are different than one another.
Yeah, even I think parenting is a great example. It just brought to mind different times when I'm, you know, you got younger kids and they're just developing into adults, and they're going to take these habits that they're forming with them. And so, you know, my son's chewing with his mouth open, and I have to tell him, hey, you're chewing with your mouth open. And at the moment, he takes that as this offense, like, oh, Dad, you don't love me. Why are you being mean to me? Why are you pointing out? You're making fun of me or something? Like, and then I have to explain, I'm not making fun of you, but someday down the road, you're going to be eating with your mouth open, and someone's going to say it a lot harsher than I am. You know, I'm just preparing you to be self-aware of, you know, your surroundings, yourself, what you're doing. And there's a delicate balance there.
Yeah, but see, also what you're doing in there, Eric, is you're modeling how he should treat someone in the future. And you're modeling in your relationship with him that proximity that you have to him that's allowed to speak in his life in that way, how he's going to go and replicate and duplicate that in the future. I think there's also, when you were talking about you and your wife, I don't know if you said her name, but we'll just say your wife.
You can say her name. I'm sure she would love it.
But there's also a level of, it's a heavy like respect that you have for somebody that you're choosing to say, hey, like, we're different and I don't get it. I love you. I'm trying to accept you, or I'm wrestling with that, but I also like respect you.
Yeah. Respect plays a big role.
I think too, and I'm pointing 10 fingers at myself. I think of like the, where Jesus is talking about like the don't look at the speck in your brother's eye when you got the log in your own eye. I think I have a problem, actually have a gift. I can see the speck and logs in everybody else. His eye. Yeah. Like it's easy to point out. It's easy to see. And I think part of like overcoming that and modeling the character, what I see in Scripture of Jesus, is being people who celebrate other people. And I think similar to the John Maxwell thing I shared earlier, find that one thing. When it comes to building cultures, and even when I think of raising my kids, and one of the things I have to constantly remind myself is what I celebrate gets repeated. And it can be easy for me to constantly point out what they're doing wrong. And I think about my 3rd grade son. I go to his basketball game. Oh my goodness. As somebody who played college basketball after the game, there's like a million things running through my mind. They say that children, like the times in life they dislike the most is after basketball games when their parents talk to them about the game. Like kids hate that. I remember I hated that. Yeah. But in my mind, there's all these things I want to tell my son. I'm like biting my tongue. And I try to find a couple of things and just celebrate. Man, you did a great job being aggressive. You did a great job encouraging your teammates. And so I think part of it, there's this cultural tendency for all of us to use truth to point out where and how other people need to change. And I think as Christians, we get the opportunity to celebrate people at such a level where that celebration says, oh my goodness, somebody cares about me. Somebody sees me. And in that celebration too, I'm affirming, the great things they're doing, which causes them to repeat those actions over and over. And the stories we tell, the things that we, highlight. I mean, there's so many ways to celebrate, but I think there's also something about finding the good, celebrating the good. It's counter-human to really celebrate. But I think what we celebrate ultimately gets repeated.
Yeah, and that's that's what coaching is. In Matthew 7, like you referred to, like I just jokingly, because I preached on that like in the fall and walked around with a plank, like just in my eye to just kind of be silly and make a good metaphor or whatever. It made a nice slide for the sermons. But
I mean, it was a solid week, wasn't it? You walked around.
But one of the things you learn is that when you have a plank in your eye, it keeps you at a distance from people, and you're not able to fully embrace, that relationship with others. You can't actually go help them take the speck out of their eye because that plank is keeping you at a distance from somebody and coaching them well. And so I remember, one of the thoughts that I kept coming to was that criticism without coaching leads to calloused hearts. And I think even that story you were sharing, or the story you're sharing with your son, like criticism without coaching, which isn't just, which is saying, hey, here's what you did great. Let me celebrate that. And here's how we're going to get better. If I'm just a critic, then I'm going to always lead that person to a calloused heart, because I'm just it's just constant abrasions, and it's going to lead to calluses. And so how do we continue to get better as Christians, as followers of Christ, at not just being critics, but being people that are known for what we're for, not just what we're against, and not always being abrasive, but coaching people to say, hey, this is worth celebrating right here. Right. If you keep doing that, then we are going to win. If you keep having your eyes open, you're going to get the ball to your other teammates, and we're going to win. And you can't turn the ball over, You've got to have your eyes open. You've got to play better defense. You've got to do all this. But if you had any kind of coach that all they spent time was, and criticizing, or your parents finish a game and all that you get is criticism, man, it's just going to erode your heart. You're going to be like Pharaoh with this hardened heart, and it's not going to be very good.
And I'll say this, I could talk about coaching forever. But also when emotions are highest, people receive coaching the least. And so we have a rule, like when we speak, or even now we've taken it to our son's basketball game, you can't say anything critical or anything that really, you can't share any coaching advice within 24 hours of that person either just speaking or like my son playing. because when our emotions are like hot, it is hard to receive that feedback. And so I think even part of these topics, we talk about race, we talk about politics, we talk about, it's hard to have rational conversations when we're in an emotional state. And so part of even, I would say, celebrating, connecting with people, tolerating, is saying, hey, let's try to bring the emotions down. Part of your wife processing and sleeping through the night and the emotions are able to come down.
Yeah.
You're able to start to process some things. And then you can have some real, I would say, truthful conversations that hopefully can lead to some change.
Yeah.
I wish the Wisconsin and Michigan coaches would have listened to this podcast this weekend. It would have been wouldn't have been so wild there.
That's the hard part, though.
Yeah.
I know they all regret what happened.
Yeah, for sure.
But our emotions, man, cause us to do things that we wish we'd have never done.
Yep. Good passengers, bad drivers.
Yep.
So how does the church function and thrive in a culture that values both of these things, or at least values their own interpretations of truth and tolerance going forward? It seems messy. I think a lot of the things that we've shared here, we can draw different parallels to, but what stands out as a good example for the church?
Jesus.
Jesus
I was thinking,
is the only way.
I know. I was thinking eyes on Jesus. That's,
Sometimes the Sunday school answer is the right one.
Well, I think almost every interaction you see, it's kind of interesting. Like the more you study Jesus' interactions, almost every interaction with sinners, he begins with grace, and almost every interaction with religious people, he begins with truth. And so the example you shared earlier with the woman caught in adultery, the example when Jesus is when Mary washes Jesus' feet, and everyone's like, "What, are you letting her touch you? That scandalous, skanky woman?" And I just said it, man, we're getting canceled. And he meets her with such grace in that moment. And then he meets her with truth, and he always leaves people with truth. But the religious people that are like, do you know who she is? Are you kidding me? You're letting her touch you? You know what's going to happen to you? You're going to get rabies or something. And he meets them constantly with truth. Even that example of the casting the stones, he meets her with grace, and I don't know what he wrote in the ground, but then he meets the religious people with truth that they need to hear in order to, I think, help them understand the grace that he wants to deliver to them.
That's so good. Yeah, words that came to my mind is we have to live and embody truth, but we have to extend grace. And, whether it's the stories you just shared, Jesus and Zacchaeus, the thing I love about that story, Jesus never even shared any truth verbally with Zacchaeus. But most of the time, people who aren't living in the truth understand their life and recognize that there is some level of truth. And so sometimes we don't have to say anything, but when we're living a certain way, when we extend grace, that's what people need to experience. The picture that comes to my mind is we have a neighbor that's been our neighbor for, 3-4 years. And her and her husband moved in with their family. And they are, let's just say very liberal, very open. Have had some interesting relationships and believe very differently than we believe. And their kids come over and hang out and play. And, over the course of years, we're just loving on them, having their daughter over to play and son over to play, hanging out with them. And one day I walk outside and my wife is hugging her and embracing her, and she's crying, and my wife was praying for her because she was going through some things in her marriage and in her relationship. I'm telling you what, she doesn't believe anything we believe. But she's posted on Facebook, and honestly, all the credit goes to my wife. She's posted on Facebook about Abide. She's posted on Facebook about us. And her posts have said, man, we have the most incredible neighbors. Because what we believe couldn't be farther apart. And we're not trying to convince her of anything. Now, I will say this. Having children is powerful because they're always telling her kids about Jesus. And just always sprinkling. We're like, hey, honey, you got to be a little careful. You don't want to share. You don't want to overstep your bounds. But there's something about when we just embody our truths, when we embody and embrace the gospel personally, but extend grace to others, it just opens up opportunities to ultimately get to a place where we can share what we believe in and share truth. I'll share this. 1 Corinthians 13:13, these three last forever, faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. And I would say what we've recognized is love is the ultimate expression of our faith. And for the unbeliever, it's unconditional love that fills them with hope that ultimately says, man, I'm interested in putting my faith in what your faith is in. For the believer, it's the faith we have in Jesus that gives us a hope for the world that ultimately allows us to extend love to the world that draws people to Jesus. And so I think when we start with love, it leads people to faith. And as people of faith, our ultimate expression of our faith is the love of God.
I think that starting with love is so important because the beginning of that chapter, it says, if I have not love, and I'm just a resounding gong and no one hears me. And so I think that's so key because I think a lot of times if love is not our motivation, then, to a world that desperately needs Christ, if we're not modeling love, then it's just like gong, 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 gong.
I was going to ask you, what does a gong sound
annoying.
like?
That's what it sounds
annoying.
like. Yeah, it's annoying. And it says in verse 6, I think, or somewhere in the middle, in that love chapter, love rejoices in truth, and so it does value truth, but love, if our motivations, if our posts on Twitter or Facebook aren't motivated by love, then man, we're making a lot of noise for a lot of bad reason. It's reckless. It's good.
Yeah.
I think one of the most convicting verses in that chapter is the love keeps no record of wrong.
Oh.
Ooh. Ouch.
And next week we'll have Matthew West on here to sing the song about it.
Oh.
Is that who sings it, right?
I don't know.
Matthew West?
I was thinking of the Bible verse.
Oh, sorry.
Not the song.
Not the song. Yeah.
But I also think just as even a takeaway, it's just how diligent are we at fostering this in ourselves, and looking to Jesus. It's being as diligent about experiencing truth and looking to Jesus and experiencing his love so that we can show that. Are we as diligent as we are as maybe tearing somebody down or getting in a conversation?
Yeah.
I don't know. There's just a lot that I think it brings up a lot of conviction. I think it brings up a lot of conversations that we can have, but it's also not being afraid to step into that and say, hey, I struggle with this, or, maybe a place where you have struggled. It's hey, I haven't been the best at this and I want to be better. Maybe saying I'm sorry. And I think that there's always hope for that.
Good.
So.
That's good. Well, I think the takeaway is to not leave this sounding like gongs. So hopefully we can do our best to not do that. Josh, thanks for your time today and all your insight on these topics, and thanks to everyone who's listening. We really appreciate it. If you have any questions or concerns, you can reach out to us on social media. You can do that at CCC Omaha, or you can send an email directly to this podcast. That email address is podcast@cccomaha.org. And until next time, we'll talk to you then.